And I want to introduce our guest today, Ann Cudd. Ann is the Provost and Senior Vice Chancellor at the University of Pittsburgh, where she's primarily responsible for Pitt's academic mission. She has a PhD in philosophy and a master's in economics, and all of you who are here got the somewhat more lengthy bio of Professor Cudd. And so, Ann, thank you for joining us. One of the things that I thought was really interesting to talk about, or at least to start, is to think of this idea of merit. Because one of the things that we're talking about right now, not just in higher education, but also throughout this country, is this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we evaluate people given their different backgrounds and given what they bring to the table. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of those issues, especially when it comes to higher education, when it comes to universities, university programs, academic programs, how you think this affects university programs generally, and how you think, say, programs could be structured to best take advantage of this type of diversity that can be brought to the table.
Well, first, let me say thank you to you, Chris, for this opportunity, and also to IHS. I really appreciate, I think the project's terrific. So yes, I'm really interested in this concept of merit. On the one hand, the concept of merit seems to me to be, first of all, overused in sort of bad ways. And I think I was sort of drawn to the whole topic from the idea of merit scholarships. Merit scholarships are really tuition discounts that universities give to students to convince them to attend that university. And yet those scholarships very often tend to go to upper middle class white students. And that tends to be the case in so many institutions where they're giving out merit scholarships. Meanwhile, the very top universities, the most elite universities, the Ivies, the Chicagos, the Stanfords, they don't give out any merit scholarships at all. Why? Because they say all of their students are meritorious, and the kind of scholarships that they give out are those scholarships that meet need, financial need. So I was wondering, is the whole concept of merit really broken with respect to scholarships, but more generally? And then you notice that there have been several books recently written about meritocracy and saying meritocracy is really just a sham. We don't have a meritocracy. What we're doing is finding ways to benefit, to privilege the upper classes, the white people, and it's a justification for really the status quo. So I wanted to look into the concept because, on the other hand, it does seem like merit, there has to be some way of saying that somebody has more potential than another, or is going to be a better contributor to your campus, or is going to be a better worker in your company, or something like that. So I wanted to look more carefully into this concept of merit. And what I'm thinking about now is, as I write, is that what we're looking for in creating a student body, or in creating groups within our companies that will be very effective, we're looking for people who are really great contributors to teamwork, to group work, right? And that's in part because really hard problems can only really be solved by groups. You'll notice that in academic research, for example, most papers these days are written by multiple authors. Most projects are taken on by multiple people working together, coming at problems from different directions. And this differs vastly from what we saw in academic research just 30 years ago when I was starting my career, for example. So single author papers are now much more rare than multiple author papers in top journals. And that's true in the social sciences as well as the natural sciences, and even becoming the case in the humanities more and more every day. So I think that we need to consider how merit can be a way of figuring out, how best to contribute to this kind of group and team effort. So I'm trying to come up with this concept of team-based merit or collective merit. And what I would like to see is higher education focus more on how to create individuals who are great members of teams and groups, rather than each one being judged on their individual skill level in some narrow range of skills that doesn't translate into teamwork.
So that sounds exactly what we're looking for. How do we do it in practice, right? So this is one of our challenges when it comes to, say, admissions decisions. At a place like Pitt, you're turning more students down than you're accepting. It might be the case that, say, at a University of New Orleans, where it's open admission, if you meet certain GPA or SAT, ACT scores, you just let everyone in. But how do we go about evaluating that, or what are the criteria that we would use? Because I don't think there's any argument that the criteria that we're using right now are defective in all sorts of ways. They're just easy, right? And if you're processing that many applications, you got to figure out a way to sort. Any thoughts on how we might go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. And in fact, I think, there are lots of institutions, I think, that are starting to think this way as well. Of course, the most elite universities typically have, big admissions groups of faculty who are looking at applications, and they do a more holistic admissions kind of judgment. And I think that's where we have to go. We have to do holistic admissions rather than relying on a certain test score or a certain GPA kind of level. But yet, as long as we're looking at a set of criteria that always includes those numbers, we tend to just look at the numbers and say, oh, well, that's going to be the criterion that will put somebody over the top. So one thing that many institutions are beginning to try, and this year is a special year for a couple of reasons, but many institutions are beginning to try either no test or test optional admissions portfolios. And this is something that we're actually going to try across a large section of our incoming population of students. So we'll see how that works. But then we're looking for other criteria. We do have a very interesting pipeline program, a program of faculty and staff who work with high school students and are beginning to look at within the sciences. So it's all STEM fields, and they provide to various communities around Pittsburgh, especially disadvantaged communities, experiences in science that are lab experiences that are really immersive and experiential and get students very interested. But when they notice that these experiences don't necessarily translate then into higher test scores, but yet they see a lot of talent within the students who are working in this area, and certainly a very passionate set of students. So they're beginning to try to come up with a set of criteria for how those experiences can be judged as experiences that will set students up for success in college. And then what they want to do is make these criteria very well known across a whole range of institutions of higher ed, and then get those criteria to be accepted as one aspect of a holistic admissions criterion. But you asked about diversity and inclusion, and one thing that I would like to go back to in our conversation at some point is this point about why groups or teams are really better off if they're more diverse and inclusive?
Let's go there now. I mean, I
I'll
think
go there.
that's
Okay.
well, because look, one of the criticisms I think that people have of programs that aim to become more diverse is that they're after a type of crayon box diversity. So I remember when I was an undergraduate at Colby College, we had one of the dining halls. There were stairs at the top, and then it went down, right? So you could stand at the top of the stairs and you looked over the whole dining hall. And the sort of joking comment was, well, what the college wanted was that for people to stand up at the top of the stairs and just see this vast array of different skin colors, basically, right? Without any real regard to backgrounds or what people are bringing to the table. And so where do you come down on the issue of diversity, and especially when it comes to teamwork and bringing folks in? Where do you see the value?
Yeah, so I think you have to step back and say, what is it that we want in a really vibrant academic culture and community? Well, that vibrancy is going to come out of people being innovative and creative and critical and comparing different ideas and learning new things. And really the only way I think that you can achieve that is through a diversity of backgrounds, perspectives, ideas. This doesn't necessarily have to be identity diversity in any standard sense, but identity diversity is one aspect of the kind of creative difference that will allow people to have new ideas, new perspectives. So the idea is that that if you have people from different backgrounds, whether it's from their ethnic or racial background, or whether it's from the training that they've had earlier or their particular interest, maybe they've study art, or they've studied science to some intense way. Putting people together across difference is going to create a whole different set of tools that you can put to work on solving a problem. And the more tools that a group has, the more likely they're going to be good at solving different problems. Now, the only problem with that is that if you have people whose differences can't be appreciated and acknowledged, and then examined and and their ideas examined and shared, then this diversity won't help you, right? So what you need is a group where differences are valued and explored and acknowledged, so that everybody in the group feels free to come forward with their different idea. And then these ideas are then examined, together in a way that makes people feel included and acknowledged, but not shut down or silenced. So those are skills. The skills of being able to listen and take in, but then also being able to accept a different idea and say, even though it's different and it conflicts with my idea, I'm going to try to juxtapose these ideas together with you, and we're going to see, where it takes us. So I think there are a variety of skills that one needs to have to do that, and I think that that's something that higher education hasn't yet really focused on, but I think we could focus very explicitly on those skills.
So two different directions that I kind of want to go here. The first is to talk some about the challenges of bringing people from diverse backgrounds to campus, because obviously, university like the University of Pittsburgh is residential. A lot of the students are living there. The time they're spending in their classes is not the majority of the time that they're spending on campus. And that students from different backgrounds, especially students who are, say, first-generation college students, or who aren't affluent or come from different cultural backgrounds, and the majority of students at the school are going to face certain challenges socially, even if the academic program is set up for success. And I know as provost, you probably don't have your hands too much in that side of it, although maybe you do, I'm not sure. But what is being done at colleges and universities from your perspective to help with that side of it? Because I know that, when I was, and again, I haven't been an undergraduate in a while, but there are a lot of schools that, I sort of joke with my friends that were teaching at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, that there are a lot of schools in our country that are HWCUs, right? They're historically white colleges and universities, and we sort of chuckle about that, but there's a social aspect to that. And I'm wondering, what have you seen be successful when it comes to, say, addressing that social aspect of learning and that social aspect of college for students who don't necessarily have the background that, say, the majority of students at a Pitt or at some of these smaller schools might have?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in fact, Student Affairs does report to me, although I have this fabulous dean of students who, runs the Student Affairs area. And so I get to pretty much watch what he does beautifully with the students, which is not to say that there's never any conflict among students, of course, but I think he does some great things. There is a whole sort of movement, and this is, largely in the academic realm, but I think it comes out of a student affairs kind of sensibility about students, and that is the idea of belongingness interventions. So belongingness interventions are just attempts to show every student, and especially this is sort of aimed at first generation students who don't have an experience of their parents or their family members talking about what it's like to be in college. But what they do is they ask the students to write a short essay about how they've overcome some kind of difficulty and give advice to the next year incoming class, okay? And by thinking about their ability to overcome and grow from that, they actually tend to focus on that kind of ability to grow. So these are called often belongingness interventions. They're pretty, low stakes and low cost, and yet they seem to have a pretty good outcome for student success. In part, they draw on this idea that is due in part to the work of Carol Dweck called mindset. And the idea is to instill in students a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset, so that students feel like, well, and not just students, it's very effective actually with people of all ages, but that there is no skill that they cannot get better at, right? There's no academic skill that anyone is born with and that anyone can't get better at. So so if you hear a student say something like, well, I'm not really a math person, and you say, well, there aren't math people. There are people who study math really hard and then end up doing better. That's the growth mindset, is that attitude that anyone can grow in their abilities. And this turns out to be interestingly enough, these interventions that aim at growth mindset are not harmful to anybody, but they really help the students from marginalized groups and first generation students. So that's one thing. I mean, I think another thing is just to always try to remember in everything that you're trying to present is that you want to make sure that every student feels that they belong here at your university, that they're not an added extra for anybody else, but rather they're an essential part of the vibrant academic environment that you're creating, which requires diversity. So the other thing that I think is really important, and this is sort of the thing that I am hoping to add as I work on this book on merit and so forth, is this idea of the diversity bonus. that we should explicitly talk about with students how diversity adds a bonus to the ability of groups to be innovative. And this idea of the diversity bonus is really due to Scott Page at the University of Michigan, who has written a couple of books about this. And it's really it's very cool idea.
Someone who's watching right now has a question related to this in terms of diversity. That when we think of diversity, we're looking at, say, a socioeconomic background or racial background or cultural background. The attendee asked whether diversity of experience, life experience, seems to be an unexplored opportunity, and that we hear about students. Some students are attending college or university later in life. Do you see anything opportunities along those lines? I mean, it would be difficult for me to imagine. We get a lot of sort of non-traditional age students at, say, UNO, but it would be difficult for me to imagine, say, a 30-year-old starting the undergraduate program at like Williams, right? I mean, it's sort of odd. It's not set up for that, but I could imagine that the 30-year-old participating in some of those classes at Williams, after they, say, spent 4 years in the armed forces or worked a job for 6 years or something, would contribute significantly to those classes. Have you thought at all about maybe life experience diversity beyond just, right, the 18-year-old from a different background is obviously different life experience, but age issues?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that if you think about diversity of perspective, experience, identity, analytical skills of various kinds, all of those aspects all bring another tool to the table. So it might be in the way that you formulate a question, or in the way you think, the kind of metaphor or analogy that you can bring to the table. And absolutely, experiences are, like experiences of serving in the military would absolutely bring that kind of thing. So, so I think there's no question that that the experience of, say, veterans or of people who've been in the workforce are valuable to solving problems, and also just bringing up bringing another point of potential conflict that teaches us how to resolve that conflict and move forward with multiple ideas in mind. So I think it's even that resolving of conflict or of potential conflict that is part of the growth that we get from bringing diverse ideas together. So I think, yeah, age diversity is very important. As I age more and more, I think that's more important.
Well, look, and conflict isn't a bad word, right? That in some sense, we want learning to be somewhat uncomfortable. We want people to be confronted with ideas that they're not familiar with, ideas that challenge them. We talked with Bro Adams, who was the president of Colby College a week or so ago, and he ran the NEH for a while. And we talked some about some of the challenges that intellectual diversity presents on campuses, and some of the problems that we've been seeing with, say, speakers getting shut down or faculty presenting certain views. And have you had to deal with anything at Pitt when it comes to, say, controversial ideas, either due to speakers or faculty or student groups? And how have you responded? How did you respond? Or how might you respond to some of that if it were to come up?
Right. Well, I think that, one needs to make a judgment call about whether a certain speaker or a speech that maybe has been already performed is one that silences an entire group of students, makes them feel like they do not belong, versus one that challenges them. And that is a very hard line to draw. But for example, if racial epithets are used, that, to me, my mind goes over the line. But if if we've got a political distinction being drawn, it might well be, it's most likely to be something that we should really work hard to help our students to see how they should, take that speech in, and counter it with their own speech. So largely ideas should be countered with ideas. There are some exceptions where an idea is expressed in such inflammatory language that an entire group of people feel like they're told they don't belong, and they aren't included in the overall conversation. So that's there's this idea of inclusive excellence that I think is a really good idea, and one that we should always look for. We want to include as many possible ideas as we can that are consistent with, you know, including as many as we can. And that's a hard line to draw sometimes. I tend to be in favor of free speech in almost every occasion, but there are some kinds of speech that are hate speech and go across the line.
Well, yeah, this is a challenge here too, because it's, I mean, you've certainly seen all the examples recently of different speakers getting shut down or shouted down or deplatformed or whatever it is. And, you know, there are some in my eyes that really have no business being on campus because all they're doing is throwing bombs. But then you have other people, right? So I think of, you know, what happened to Charles Murray at Middlebury. And he's an interesting case because one, he presents himself as an academic and an intellectual. He's not just a bomb thrower like, I don't know, a Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter or these people, right? But whenever Charles Murray shows up, right, there are a group of students, rightly or wrongly, who start talking about how what he's doing is dehumanizing them, or his speech is violence or something along these lines. It's a difficult decision. Now, I won't ask you to comment specifically on Charles Murray, but I mean, I think this is a challenge that I'm seeing, that we've got students who, rightly or wrongly, I don't know how to put this, right? So rightly or wrongly, you know, I'm going to take them at face value, right? So you've got students who say that when you present certain ideas on campus, it delegitimizes me or marginalizes me, and I'm already a member of a marginalized group. How do you go about responding to that? Because there's part of me who says, look, if you bring some white dude on campus or someone who's criticizing like white dudes who play golf, like, I'm not going to be upset by that. Like, I'll be like, yeah, I think you're wrong, but I'm not going to feel marginalized. I'm not going to feel like I'm not included. But I can also see how someone who is constantly, I'm going to say, under threat in their daily lives encounters something like this, where people are taking these ideas seriously and they say, look, this is causing me problems. How do you sort of wade through that? Because I imagine you can see a bit of truth on both sides of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you have to do is support the students who, from the marginalized communities, from the minoritized communities, and you need to allow them to have their speakers, or to invite speakers, and to have protests, but not shout down the other speaker unless they really cross over that you know, truly hate speech line. And so, you know, I think in this case, you just support more speech. You support protest that falls short of shouting down. So we actually, in my first year here, we had Ben Shapiro come to campus.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And that was, yes, you know, his message is not particularly appealing to me personally, and it is offensive to some. But we had actually a pretty good experience because, again, our brilliant dean of students, he prepared the students really well. He had a few different conversations with them and encouraged them to let the speech go forward, but protest outside of the building if they wanted to, or go into the talk and ask hard questions. And we did have some students who asked questions that, you know, at least revealed Mr. Shapiro's odious views in full display, so that they could, sort of at least say that this person, unless you're really going to buy into odious views, you've got to disagree with him. And then the protests outside were sending a message that we don't agree. So this is what we're doing, right now in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and the other horrible events, the racist attacks on various Black Americans. We've been getting, racialized tweets of various kinds from incoming students, or, anyway, so we, some of them go over the line, right? And I think every university is having these kinds of discussions, and some of them just sort of display a certain kind of ignorant disregard for systemic racism, a misunderstanding of the facts of systematic exclusion and systematic and institutionalized racism. And so what we're trying to do in those cases is educate, express our real disagreement, in a tweet. So in a fairly short form, this is our disagreement. This is false. We regard this as something like Holocaust denial. I mean, it's that kind of false. It doesn't express our values. And then, but if it falls short of that, line where we exclude someone, then we say, and we will, we'll be speaking with this person about how they can become educated on the facts of systemic racism. So we're actually dealing with that right now, and I'm sure that most provosts are as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, but as you say, some good hopefully can come out of it, because, like you, I see our institutions as, right, we have an educational mission, right? And it's not just about educating our students and doing what's best for our students and their 18-year-old selves, right? There's going to be a 35-year-old version of that student who looks back and says, well, what did I get out of my time at Pitt? But also we've got to function to help advance knowledge in society generally. And so, maybe go back to more pleasanter things when it comes to, what we're trying to get out of that discussion of teamwork, as you say, right? Why do you think, say, higher education or a university like Pittsburgh is, say, well suited for developing the type of teamwork skills that you're talking about? I mean, clearly these are the type of skills that employers are looking for, right? That you want people to come out, you want them to understand how to work in teams, you want them to understand, how to approach projects in different ways and to see what other people from different backgrounds can add to those projects. But why the university? I mean, why not? What do you say to the person who comes in and says, well, it sounds like what you want is just people to be doing apprenticeships after high school, have them go off, work a couple of jobs, have them go into the real world, because once you hit the real world, you're gonna learn this very quickly. What do you say to someone like that? What is the unique role that the university can play in something like this?
Right. So one thing I think that we have kind of an obligation in our social mission to create the leaders of the future. We have an obligation to do that as well as we can. And in fact, having a credential from an institution of higher education is going to probably lead such people into positions of leadership. So we better do it, or else they're not going to be as equipped as they should be to create diverse and creative, innovative teams. So I think there is that obligation. But why do I think we can do it well? First of all, academics, as I said before, are becoming more and more team workers themselves, right? We haven't really, I think, at least not in the arts and sciences, in liberal arts areas, we haven't really explicitly looked at why does that work? And what is it that's working well about, working together in teams? And when does it work well and when does it not? I guess a similar kind of debate we've had is over interdisciplinarity. And when does interdisciplinarity work well and when is it just kind of a watered down mishmash, right? And I think we're discovering various things, in 30 years into the interdisciplinarity project. And I think likewise, we can learn similar things with teamwork. And then we can make that explicit. We can make that a topic of conversation and an area that we can teach. So I think, one of these things is this diversity bonus idea, and the model of the diversity bonus based on this toolbox idea. So there's kind of a simple idea, and then you say, well, you want lots of different tools. Some of them are analytical tools like mathematical and computational skills and scientific reasoning, but some of them are also differing perspectives, differing languages, even if that's within the same, basic family of English, maybe just different metaphors and analogies that one draws on. So I think we can explicitly teach the model of the diversity bonus, the toolbox model of the diversity bonus, for one thing. And then there's lots of empirical results that one can also look at and say, okay, now why did this work? Now, one thing you might say is, well, that begins to sound like kind of a business school education, right? Especially when you start to study cases and so forth. And I say, well, that may be actually the good part of the business education, is focusing on how you can get teamwork to work particularly well. And I think there are other aspects of it as well. If you look at how projects get put together across different disciplines or different areas of expertise, you see that also involves a bringing together of several different languages. And like the language of, maybe the language of HR and the legal, and the language of maybe the epidemiologist or the person who's creating the vaccine, right? And you need to bring these things together in order to ultimately get to where you have, say, a vaccine that works, that can be sold, that can be marketed, that you can get into the hands of doctors and so forth. Just picking a random example for
Sure.
this time period. And I think that these two skills, the sort of the appreciating the value of diversity from this kind of toolbox perspective and appreciating the skills needed to bring different disciplines and analytical and background perspectives together to speak the same language so that a project can get finished. These are the kinds of skills that we need to instill in our students. And even though that might look a little businessy to the arts and sciences professor or to the arts and sciences dean, I think that is an aspect of our curriculum we need to add.
So I've got one more question before we go to some of the audience questions. And it's the question that I always enjoy asking college presidents and provosts, because unless you're an academic and unless you start doing administrative work, you don't realize how difficult it is to change the culture at any college or university. A president comes in or a provost comes in and a dean comes in, and you inherit a faculty, you inherit a culture, and steering a ship is usually the analogy, but it often turns slower than the ship. Let's say that you were starting your own school from scratch and you didn't inherit a faculty, you didn't inherit a culture. What dramatic change would you implement to how things are done right now? That would you implement at this new college or university, which you could do because you weren't inheriting, faculty and culture, but you think that it would be a significant improvement over either the curriculum or a process or something that's going on at our colleges and universities right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I would probably begin with a liberal arts-based general education program that focuses on skill development and in particular these sort of analytical and communication skills, but also these skills of benefiting from and working together with diverse others, right, in order to achieve a collective outcome that you agree on. And so, you know, I think I would, from the very beginning, build in the idea that working together, collaborating, that working as teams, that's a really essential skill. And it's also kind of fun, you know, so even, you know, mastering analytical techniques, mathematics, when you study together, that's a good way to learn, and it's also fun. And so I think I would probably encourage all of my faculty to teach in ways that are geared towards solving problems in groups. But then the traditional disciplines would be very important, I think, you know, very important sort of subject areas and content areas to study. So I think you then get the best of both worlds. And I think that's not so far from what, you know, work like what the AAC&U is working on with their, you know, focus on general education, or many different teaching and learning centers who are focused on flipped classes, so focusing on problem solving and doing that in groups. But I'd also throw in the diversity bonus theory as well.
Sounds good. So we've got two questions that relate to kind of how we do this in practice, especially when it comes to the admission side. One person asked, so if we're looking at SAT, ACT, and GPA of high schools, let's say, they seem to give some sort of objective appearance that's easy to measure. But that the person asked, well, the holistic approach seems superior, but how do you do that in practice? How do admission officers deal with that, especially when they're trying to evaluate people with some sort of objectivity? And then we had another question along these same lines asking whether there was anyone who really disagreed on taking this holistic approach instead of looking at presumably something that was more, you know, I'm going to do the scare quotes, right? Objective, like GPA and SAT. And this person asked whether this is a contentious issue among faculty and administrators, or whether it was just a challenge to figure out how do you go about doing that in practice.
Yeah, no, I think it is a challenge. I mean, there is lots of research that shows that that SAT scores, for instance, ACT, that these test scores are correlated with at least first year performance, you know, freshman year performance in school. And then there's it's a little bit more ambiguous as to whether that picks out performance overall and graduation rate. But those are all, you know, good things. And so, I mean, really, that's one good thing. I should also add another, and that is many people argue that it's that people, that bias is harder to come in when there's an objective score, right? So it doesn't matter what my race or gender is. If I got double 800s on the SAT, then I'm, you know, nobody could say, or this is how the argument goes, nobody could say that I'm not a fantastic student with a lot of potential, right? And so, you know, many people who've succeeded because of their scores will point to that and say, I might have been discriminated against for my background, my race, my, you know, socioeconomic class, my gender, but for my performance on those tests. And I think that is an important point. Those tests initially came around as an attempt to sort of overcome socioeconomic class as an area of bias. But that said, and I think this is the kind of somewhat more radical critique that I would like to run against the SAT. What we're doing is when we say, well, this predicts first year performance, well, that's because, one might say that's because those who have succeeded in the SAT are the ones who are setting the bar for first year performance. They're creating all the criteria for first year performance. So of course it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we have diverse voices and different kinds of perspectives, perhaps we will be rewarding different kinds of achievement that can't be as easily measured through the SAT as they could be if we came through a different kind of holistic and process that's focused on potential ability to contribute to diverse creative groups, which is what I would say the best criterion is.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you have a question, as a reminder, go ahead. You can click the button down at the bottom and type it in. We've got another one asking, and I want to get all of this in here. So how should we think through improvement versus excellence? It seems like we should celebrate institutions and educational metrics that emphasize improvement in student outcomes, such as growth from when they start a program versus ending it. But we tend to focus on overall achievement. The latter is obviously important, but do we end up pouring additional resources into marginal gains among the students already doing well? And let me add to this that I don't know if this is what the person who asked this question also had in mind, but I think about this when we do testing too. So you've got a PhD in philosophy. Have you ever had the pleasure of teaching an intro logic class?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Many times.
That's what I figured. Okay. So from my perspective, when I teach introduction to logic, part of me doesn't care when they learn the material, right? As long as they end up learning it. But a lot of times when you have classes, right, that they need to learn certain things by like the 6th week of class, right? Or they're failing an exam that costs 20% of their grade. I wonder if there's a different way, and this might be slightly different than what the person was asking, but so you can answer them both or whatever you'd like. How do we go about measuring these outcomes? What should we be focused on? And then ultimately, how do we set up these academic programs, whether on a class level or on a programmatic level, to best capture what we're trying to do and what's pedagogically the best thing to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you come up with the example of logic, I think that intro logic, I mean, what we want to do is there are certain kinds of basic concepts we want people to understand and really understand deeply. The concept of validity and how that differs from soundness. That's a really important concept to grasp. So what I think we should do is set up learning objectives and try to, get our students from wherever they are at the beginning to that point that they've objectively, that they have mastered those objectives. There are other courses that might allow for more open-endedness in terms of the outcome that you want, right? Although you want students in an ethics class to know a few different theories, you certainly want them to be able to apply them across a wider range that would be open-ended in a way that providing a valid argument for a certain, providing the proof of a valid argument is not quite so open-ended. But to the point about whether we're trying to achieve a sort of an outcome with a college education or move the needle for a particular student, I think it's probably both, right? But moving the needle is obviously the thing that we are providing the most social benefit when we do that, right? We're getting people from, getting people farther along the learning curve. And I think that's, that's great. Institutions are also providing a credential. And that credential is a signal to employers and to others that the student has reached a certain level of achievement, sophistication, and that is also part of our social mission to credentialize students. So there are multiple things we're trying to do. I think, you know, there's room in higher education for a wide range of projects and to bring in students from a wide range of backgrounds as well.
So we've got about 10 more minutes. I kind of want to push you a little bit more on that about bringing the students in from the backgrounds wide range, because I think this is really important. You know, I think of, say, the first generation college student from New Orleans, from a Black family who grows up in a very different environment from, say, the student who comes from the Northeast and has, you know, is perhaps the more traditional profile for, I don't know about Pitt, but certainly some of the smaller colleges up there. I just wonder how we go about making things better socially for these students to put them in a position to succeed, because you can do everything you want in the classes. You can find people academic advisors, you can help them through the academic curriculum. But if they're not having that same experience, right? Like, look, let's, so I went up to Colby for when I was an undergraduate. And I was basically around a bunch of people who had similar backgrounds that I did. The only difference was I was from the South. Now, my parents are from the Northeast, and it wasn't a big deal. But I can just imagine, I don't have to imagine, I was friends with a number of the Black students on campus. And there were like 30 of them, right? And so it was incredibly difficult. And the school did so much to try to make these students, to give them, you know, a situation that allowed them to be successful, but it was incredibly difficult for them. What can we be doing? Because part of me says that, you know, if I've got a really good minority student, Black student right now, there's part of me that says, you know what, you really should go to like a Morehouse or a Howard. Right? Because there's so much of a social aspect to college that if you end up at like Williams, you're going to have a challenge. But you're in this position where it's like, do you turn down one of the top 5 universities, the college universities in the country for something that's perhaps not as strong academically? So what can we do? And because part of me says there's a safety in numbers argument, that if you can just bring a lot more people in, right, that's going to fix some of these problems. But unless you're Harvard or Yale or Princeton, who has that kind of money? Like, how do we solve this? Because, or have I got this wrong?
Yeah. I mean, if
you see the problem though, that I'm
right. But you know, in fact, the Harvards and the Yales, they do not bring in a very diverse group of students because they're very wedded to a certain picture of what counts as the meritorious student, right? So I think actually it's an institution like mine or like yours that is better suited to actually achieve the kind of rich, multicultural, multiracial mix of students, but we have to do it. And to this point, so we're working on it at Pitt, but we're, you know, inching up at 1% at a time, you know, each year. And that's both on the student side and the faculty side and the staff side for that matter as well. And I think we have to be committed to diversifying. I mean, I'm completely committed to diversifying our campus on both racial and socioeconomic class lines, because I think that otherwise what we're doing is we're reinforcing an unequal status quo and thereby making it even more difficult for social mobility for a wide range of our co-citizens. So, you know, I think we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution. We don't really, there's no no middle ground here. Because we're such powerful institutions in terms of setting people up for economic and political and social success, we're so important in that if we don't help to diversify and to make social mobility a possibility for a wide range of our co-citizens, then we're making things worse.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. I mean, one of the reasons why I mentioned a place like Harvard is because they have the resources, they could do it, right? They could snap their fingers and overnight, right? They can cover the costs of all of their undergraduates.
Right.
We can at the University of New Orleans, and I imagine you can't either. But you're probably in a better position than we are. You know, I guess so. My question, and maybe you can't answer this, but when you've certainly gone out and done fundraising, do you see people who you're interacting with when you talk with them about donating to the university that they're interested in supporting something like this? Because I mean, to some extent, the current model where you've got $70,000, $80,000 a year for an undergraduate education at some of these, it's not sustainable in any way.
Right.
Now, and a lot of that money is paying for people who can't afford it. But if you can't, find other places to get these resources, I don't see how you do it. What's the strategy there financially? How do we get this to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, a strategy, you're right. The strategy is to, I think, to, have a whole different range of tuition costs depending on family ability to pay. And I'm pretty committed to need-based financial aid. And what I think we need to do is go away from merit-based aid. The problem is that's a kind of prisoner's dilemma if we think of rankings as important, and if rankings continue to use SAT score in particular, or ACT score, as a way of ranking schools. So now recently, the US News and World Report has included a measure of socioeconomic diversity that I think is helpful. So the percentage of Pell eligible students is one aspect of the rating that each university gets in order to be ranked. And then the achievement gap between Pell and non-Pell eligible students is the other thing that universities are rated and ranked on. But that right now constitutes 5% of the ranking criteria. So it's the start, and it actually is, it gives somebody like me an ability to argue in favor of, moving towards need-based financial aid, away from merit-based aid, in order to do better on this ranking. But it's not enough. And so, if we could all agree to, get rid of the ranking system or something like that, and come up with some, diversity-based or maybe rule out all merit-based aid, right? That would be collusion, right? But if we could all the universities say, we're not going to give so-called merit-based aid anymore, we're only giving need-based aid, I think that would be a big help, because it would, disarm. It would be like, disarmament in the competition for students. But unfortunately, I think we're going in the wrong direction in admissions competition right now. But I think that's what we need to do, is we need to focus on financial need and focus on this other kind of conception of merit, where it's the diversity that you bring to a group that constitutes your merit. So kind of the more different you are from the current student body, that is a mark of the contribution that you can bring to the group.
We're almost out of time, but I've got to ask you one more question on this, because for people who aren't aware of rankings or how admissions makes decisions or how this Can you say a little bit about how the ranking system drives the decisions that are made, whether it's at the admissions level or the programmatic level, or how that affects, you know, how it affects your decisions at the university?
So first of all, we believe, and I think this is pretty well borne out by empirical evidence, that that families pay attention to rankings, and that they mean so much that, you know, a difference in 10 points in the US News ranking system makes for a very different set of applications. And we're competing for a lot of students and for, you know, for good students, however we define good. And so we want to be ranked higher rather than lower. Given that as sort of the background, that's one of the things that we're aiming for. Then what we do is we look at, well, what are the criteria on which we are ranked, and how can we improve on those criteria? Now you might say that's gaming the system, and there are some ways that are very much cynical ways of gaming that system. There are other things, like I would argue the Pell eligible part, you know, the raising the number of Pell eligible, that's not gaming the system. That's in fact getting a better, more diverse group of students to your campus. But there are other things like, you know, fortunately they've dropped the number of applications as a criterion on which you're ranked, because that's really cynical. You're inviting applications from students you have no intention of admitting, simply to go higher on the ranking system. And there are some that are even worse than that I won't mention.
We did that at Tulane right after Katrina, that Tulane had more applications than any other private school in the country, because we dropped the application fee and we sent off all these things to get students to apply. Any other, we've got to go. Any other sort of cynical things that you can, I mean, those of us who know this are there, but things that you actually have to respond to. I mean, the applications one is one, but other things that are still, that comment on?
There's the fact that if US News and World Reports only looks at the first-time full-time freshmen. So you can bring in all the transfer students you want and their metrics do not count. Or you can bring in students in the spring semester rather than the fall, and then their metrics don't count. So those, I think, are some of the more cynical admissions ploys.